This is going to be an example of saving data to a save game object via widgets. We will be using a buff, save game objects, widgets, and a struct. I went ahead and skipped showing you how to make the buff, the save game, the struct, and the widget, since it's fairly rudimentary, found mostly in this drop-down box here. For our struct, we're going to be using two pieces of data, a string and an int. You can name them whatever you want, but this is just an example, so. First thing we're going to do is create our widget. It'll be pretty simple in this example, just to show you how it's done. Once you're done designing your layout, we need to add a few events. For the string and integer fields, we need to have an onText committed event. And for the button, we need the clicked event. With the clicked event, all we have to do is remove from viewport. We also need to add our data struct into the widget as a variable. You need to check editable and expose on spawn so that the pin for the widget creation shows this variable. For the committed events, we want to change the data on the struct to the text data in the string fields. In order to communicate with our buff, I'm going to be using a dispatcher. You can use an interface, or you can pass in a buff reference to your widget, although the latter is not recommended. We'll need a dispatcher for updating the data on the struct, and we'll also need one to call the save function, so that we can update the save data and notify the buff when the widget is closed. We also need to enable and disable the mouse and input modes when you show the widget and when you remove it from the viewport. Otherwise, you won't get a cursor and you won't be able to type correctly. When the widget is constructed, we need to set the text fields to the data on the struct that's passed into it. To summarize, the widget is constructed, the struct is passed into the widget, and the text fields are filled in with the data in them. When you press the Save button, it removes from the viewport. Remove viewport calls a save dispatcher on the buff. The input mode is returned to game only so that you can access the game properly and the mouse is hidden. When the widget is added to viewport, the mouse is shown and you can interact with the widget correctly. Now for our buff. This is a simple example and isn't exactly the best approach to do things, but when the buff will be added to the player, there'll be a tiny delay, and then we will load the save game, go to the client, pass the data to the client, build the widget, and display everything for input. First thing we need to do is make sure we're on the server, and then load our save game. This is the name of the save game we'll try to load. This code right here will be the default values if the save doesn't exist yet. You can put in whatever you wish. Now that we have our save game stuff set up, we need to send the data on the save game, if it's loaded or otherwise, to the client so that the client can build the widget. For this, we need a custom event that runs on the client. Now that we're on the client, we need to build our widget, add it to the viewport, and set up our dispatchers so that the data sent back is actually received. This is how we set up dispatchers. When this dispatcher fires, it will be the new data that the user entered into the text fields. We want to make sure we save it back into our SafeGame data variable so that when we're done with it, we can save it to our SafeGame object. When this dispatcher fires, it will be because the save button was pressed. From there, we want to go back to the server, save the new data that we have here into our SafeGame object. For that, we will need another custom event running on the server this time. Now that we're back on the server, we need to update the SafeGame, and then in this case, just because I want to, we can deactivate the buff since it's no longer necessary. Since this is only an example, I will just be force adding the buff to myself, but normally you'd be doing this through some other means, whether that be a script command or a radial menu or what have you. The widget appears, we have our mouse, the default values are loaded since the save didn't exist yet. We'll just type in something random, and we'll push save. Next time when the buff opens, all of our data is loaded again. So to recap, the buff is added on the server. We load our save game. If it doesn't exist, we create our save game with default values and then save it. We then go to the client with the save game data. This will be the default values if they didn't exist, or the saved values if it already did exist. Once we're on the client with the data, we save it into a variable temporarily so that we can edit it later with our widget. We create our widget and pass in the data, add it to the viewport, set up our dispatchers. This dispatcher is for updating the data, and this one is to call the save event when the save button is pressed. When the save button is pressed, we go to the server with the new data, save it to the save game, and deactivate the buff. On the widget, when the widget's constructed, we'll set the default values from the struct passed into the widget. Remember, editable and expose on spawn have to be checked in order to get that pin to appear on create widget. Right here. The committed events for the text fields, change the values on the struct accordingly, and call the updated dispatcher on the buff so that the buff can update the temporary variable that will be used to set the save game data. Added to viewport enables the mouse. Remove from viewport calls the save dispatcher and removes the mouse. And the save button calls remove from viewport so that this is fired.